Why is the account empty? My daughter's voice cracked across my kitchen like something fragile finally breaking, and I didn't look up right away. I just kept stirring my tea, watching the thin swirl of steam rise into the quiet morning air as if nothing at all had changed, as if the question she had just asked wasn't the very thing I had been waiting for weeks now. Mom, I'm serious. I just logged in, everything's gone, she said again, louder this time, and I could hear the edge creeping into her voice, that same sharp edge I used to hear when she was a teenager trying to hide something behind impatience. I set the spoon down carefully on the saucer, the soft clink sounding louder than it should have in the stillness of my house. The same house I had lived in for 34 years. The same kitchen where I had packed her lunches, paid her college tuition, and once stayed up all night balancing checkbooks just to make sure she never had to worry about money the way I did when I was her age. I finally lifted my eyes to meet hers, and for a moment I didn't recognize the woman standing there, her perfectly styled hair slightly out of place, her phone clenched tightly in her hand, her expression somewhere between panic and disbelief. That's strange, I said calmly, my voice even, almost gentle, the way it had always been when she came to me with a problem, and she blinked at me like she was trying to figure out if I was joking. Strange? Mom, there's over $600,000 missing, she said, her words coming faster now, tripping over each other, and I could see it clearly then, not fear for me, not concern for my well-being, but fear of something else slipping out of her control, something she had already decided belonged to her. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, feeling the quiet strength settle in my chest, the kind that doesn't come from anger but from understanding. From finally seeing things as they are instead of how you wish they could be. I moved it, I said simply, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything she could have shouted. She stared at me, her mouth parting just slightly, her eyes searching my face for some sign that I wasn't serious. But I didn't give her one. I had spent too many years giving her everything else. You what? She whispered, and for the first time since she walked into my house that morning, she sounded small again, like the little girl who used to stand in this same kitchen asking for permission, asking for guidance, asking for me. But that girl had been gone for a long time, replaced by someone who smiled a little too sweetly when she talked about helping me with my finances, someone who asked a few too many questions about passwords and account numbers, someone who had started to look at me not like a mother, but like a problem to be managed. I picked up my cup and took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle before I spoke again. I moved every penny, I said, and this time I held her gaze, steady and unflinching, and in that moment I watched something shift in her expression, the calculation, the quiet confidence she had carried into this room. It all began to crack, and I realized then that she hadn't expected this, not from me, not from the woman who had always said yes, always trusted, always believed that love was enough to keep a family honest. But love, I had learned, doesn't protect you from being seen as an opportunity, it just makes it easier for others to forget where the line is. And as she stood there, struggling to understand how the ground beneath her had suddenly disappeared, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, not victory, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop pretending you don't see what's right in front of you. And for the first time since my husband passed, I wasn't reacting anymore, I was ahead of it. I could see her searching for a way out of it, the way she always had when things did not go exactly the way she planned, her mind moving quickly behind her eyes, trying to rewrite the situation in real time. You should have told me, she said finally, her tone shifting again, less panic now, more accusation, as if I had somehow done something wrong by acting before asking for her permission, and that was the moment something inside me settled completely, because that sentence revealed more than anything else she had said. It told me exactly how she saw me now, not as someone who still had control over her own life, but as someone who was supposed to report decisions, to consult, to defer. I tilted my head slightly, studying her face the same way I used to when she was a child, trying to explain why something was broken, waiting for the truth to slip through the cracks of her words. Told you what, Emily? I asked quietly, and she hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough, Enough for me to see the gap between what she wanted to say and what she could actually admit. That you were going to move everything, she replied, her voice tighter now, and I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch again, because silence had become my strongest ally. It made people reveal more than they intended, it made them uncomfortable enough to fill it with honesty, or at least with something close to it. She shifted her weight, glancing down at her phone before looking back at me. I was just trying to make things easier for you, she added, and there it was again, that word easier, the same word she had used 3 nights ago, the same word that had sounded so reasonable at the time, but now felt like a carefully chosen disguise. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table, my fingers steady, my voice calm. Easier for who? I asked, and this time she did not answer right away. Her lips parted, then closed, her eyes flickering with something that looked a lot like frustration, and I realized she was not used to this version of me, the one who asked questions instead of accepting answers, the one who did not rush to smooth things over, the one who was no longer trying to keep the peace at her own expense. And that realization seemed to unsettle her more than anything else, because it meant the rules had changed. Without her noticing, she took a step back, as if putting physical distance between us might give her space to regain control. Mom, you are overthinking this, she said, forcing a small laugh that did not quite land. You have always trusted me, why would that change now? And I almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, because that was the final piece, the assumption that my trust was permanent, unconditional, something she could rely on no matter how far she pushed. I sat back again, letting out a slow breath, feeling the weight of years of quiet observation settle into something clear and undeniable. Trust is not something you get to keep just because you had it once, I said, my voice still gentle, still controlled, but firm in a way it had never been before, and I watched as her expression shifted again, this time not to panic or frustration, but to something more uncertain, something closer to realization, as if she was beginning to understand that this was not just about a bank account, not just about money that had been moved out of her reach, but about something much deeper that had already slipped away long before she ever logged into that account. And as the silence returned once more, I could feel it settling differently. Between us now, no longer heavy with confusion, but clear, defined, and impossible to ignore. I remembered the first time she asked me about my accounts, not directly, not in a way that would raise concern, but casually, almost absent-mindedly, as if it were just another part of conversation between a daughter and her mother. It had been about 8 months after my husband passed, during one of those Sunday afternoons when she came by with coffee, and stayed just long enough to remind me how quiet the house had become. Are you keeping everything in one place? She had asked, stirring her drink without looking at me, and I had answered without thinking, because at the time there was no reason not to. I told her about the bank, about the savings we had built over decades, about how her father used to say that security was not about how much you had, but how carefully you protected it. She had smiled at that, a soft, approving smile that felt warm in the moment, but now, looking back, felt measured. Like she was filing something away, and that was how it always started, small questions, harmless on the surface, easy to dismiss, easy to answer, until they began to form a pattern I could not ignore. Questions about passwords framed as concern for emergencies, suggestions about consolidating accounts to simplify things, little comments about how difficult it must be to keep track of everything alone, each one placed carefully, spaced out just enough that I did not feel overwhelmed, just guided, gently, steadily, towards something I did not fully see yet. And I realized then that the plan had not begun 3 nights ago with those papers. It had started long before that, built piece by piece in conversations I had once believed were rooted in care. I looked at her now, standing in my kitchen, and I wondered how long she had been thinking about it, how many times she had sat across from me, smiling, nodding, listening, while quietly measuring what could be taken and how easily it could be done. You have been asking about my money for a while, I said, not accusing, just stating something that had finally become clear, and she stiffened slightly, the smallest reaction, but enough. I was concerned, she replied quickly, too quickly, and I nodded again. Because that was the answer I expected, the answer she had been giving in different forms for months. I stood up slowly, moving to the counter where the envelope had once sat, the place where everything had shifted for me, and I ran my fingers lightly over the surface as if I could still feel the weight of those papers, the quiet certainty they carried. "Concern does not usually come with legal forms," I said, and this time she did not try to laugh it off. She did not offer another explanation right away. She just watched me, her expression tightening as the distance between what she had intended and what had actually happened became impossible to ignore, and I could see it clearly now, not just the plan, but the assumption behind it, that I would not notice, that I would not question, that I would simply follow the path she laid out because that is what I had always done, and for a moment I felt something close to sadness, not for the money, not for what she had tried to do, but for the realization that somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing me as someone who could still think, still decide, still protect herself. She had mistaken kindness for weakness, trust for blindness, and as I turned back to face her, I understood that this moment was not just about correcting her mistake, it was about redefining who I was in her eyes, perhaps for the first time in years, and the quiet that followed was no longer uncertain, it was deliberate, shaped by everything I had chosen not to say until now. She took a slow breath, and for a moment I thought she might finally say something honest, something real, but instead she straightened her posture slightly, lifting her chin just enough to rebuild that composure she always relied on when things started slipping. "You are making this into something it is not," she said, her tone steadier now, more controlled, as if she had decided that confidence alone could shift the balance back in her favor, and I watched her carefully, noticing how quickly she adapted, how easily she stepped back into a version of herself that sounded reasonable, almost convincing, if you did not look too closely. "Those forms were just in case, just to make sure everything was taken care of if something happened to you," she continued, and there it was again, that careful phrasing, always framed as protection, always positioned as necessity, never once acknowledging the line she had been preparing to cross. I walked slowly back to my chair and sat down, taking my time, because time was something I had learned to use differently now, not rushing to respond, not filling every gap, letting her sit in the weight of what had already been revealed. "If something happened to me," I repeated quietly, and she nodded quickly, seizing on that as if it were agreement. "Exactly, you live alone, Mom, and things can change so fast. I just wanted to make sure I could step in," she said, her voice softening again, almost pleading now, and for a brief moment I saw a glimpse of the daughter I used to know, the one who came to me for reassurance, the one who trusted me completely. But that moment passed just as quickly as it came, replaced by the version standing in front of me now, the one who had already imagined herself stepping into my place, managing my life, controlling what I had built. I folded my hands together and looked at her steadily. "You were not preparing for something to happen to me," I said, my voice calm but certain. "You were preparing for something to happen to my control." And that was when her expression changed again, not to anger, not to denial, but to something quieter, something that looked a lot like being seen too clearly. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then hesitated, and in that hesitation I understood everything I needed to know. She had not expected to be questioned this way, not by me, not by the person she had already placed into a smaller role in her mind. "That is not fair," she said finally, but the words sounded thinner now, less certain, and I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet acknowledgement of how far apart we now stood. "Fairness is not what this is about," I replied. "This is about understanding what you were really asking for." And I let that settle between us, because the truth does not need to be repeated to be understood, it just needs to be allowed to exist without interruption. She looked down at her phone again, her grip tightening, her thumb hovering over the screen as if she could somehow fix this by checking something one more time. But there was nothing left for her to find there, nothing left for her to access, and I could see it starting to sink in. Not just that the money was gone from where she expected it to be, but that the version of me she had built her plans around was gone as well, replaced by someone she no longer knew how to navigate, and as the silence returned once more, it felt different again, no longer uncertain, no longer tense, but settled, like something that had finally reached its natural conclusion, even if either of us had said it out loud yet. She finally sat down across from me, slower this time, as if the ground beneath her had become less certain, and for the first time since she walked in, she did not try to speak right away. She just sat there, her phone resting on the table, her eyes fixed somewhere between me and the surface of the wood, and I could see the shift happening. Not dramatic, not sudden, but quiet and undeniable, like something inside her was recalibrating, trying to understand a version of reality she had not prepared for. "Where did you move it?" she asked eventually, her voice lower now, stripped of that earlier sharpness, and I noticed she did not say why, she did not say for what purpose, just where, as if the location itself might still give her some way back in. I let out a slow breath and leaned back slightly, feeling the calm settle deeper into me. "Somewhere safe," I said, and that answer seemed to frustrate her more than anything else I had said so far, because it offered nothing she could work with, no detail to question, no opening to step through, just a closed door, and I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the table before going still again. "I am your daughter," she said after a moment, and there was something different in her tone now, not just insistence, but something closer to a reminder, as if that title alone should change everything, as if it should still carry the same weight it once did, and I nodded slowly, because that part was still true, nothing she had done had erased that, but it had changed what that meant. "Yes, you are," I replied, and I let the silence sit there for a second before continuing. "And I am still your mother." And something in that seemed to land, not sharply, but deeply, because it was not a correction, it was a boundary, one that had not been clearly drawn before, at least not in a way she had taken seriously. She looked up at me then, really looked, and I could see the question forming behind her eyes, the one she had not asked yet, the one she was not sure how to ask without admitting too much. "Do you not trust me?" she said finally, and there it was, the question she thought would bring things back to something familiar, something emotional, something she could navigate more easily, but I did not answer it the way she expected. I did not rush to reassure her. I did not soften it with comfort. I simply considered it, letting the weight of it settle between us, because trust was not something that could be answered in a single word anymore, not after everything I had seen, everything I had finally allowed myself to understand. "I trust what I see," I said quietly, and her expression shifted again, confusion first, then something sharper, because that answer did not give her what she needed, it did not confirm anything, it only reflected something back at her, something she could not easily dismiss. "And what do you see?" she asked, and I held her gaze steady and calm. "I see someone who was ready to take control of things that were never hers to manage," I said, not raising my voice, not adding emphasis, just stating it plainly. And this time she did not interrupt, she did not argue right away, she just sat there, absorbing it, because the truth, when it is said without anger, without accusation, has a way of settling more deeply than any argument ever could, and as the quiet stretched between us once more, I realized that this was the moment everything had been leading to, not the missing money, not the empty account, but this, the moment where there was nothing left to misunderstand, nothing left to explain away, only what was, and what had always been just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. She looked at me for a long moment after that, as if waiting for me to take it back, to soften what I had just said into something more familiar, something easier to accept, but I did not. I simply held her gaze, calm and steady, and eventually she looked away first, her shoulders lowering slightly as the weight of the moment settled in. "So that is it then?" she asked, her voice quieter now, not sharp, not defensive, just tired in a way I had not heard before, and I considered that question carefully, because it sounded simple, but it carried something deeper underneath, something about endings, about lines that once crossed could not be uncrossed. I folded my hands together again, resting them on the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the present. "That depends," I said, and she looked back at me, her brow tightening slightly, waiting. "On what?" she asked, and I could hear the uncertainty there now, the shift from certainty to questioning, and I realized this was the moment where everything could either close completely or reshape into something new, something more honest. On whether you understand what you were really trying to do, I replied, and she exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the window for a second before returning to me, as if she needed that distance to think. I was trying to help you, she said again, but this time the words sounded less certain, like she was repeating something she had told herself too many times, and I nodded, not to agree, but to acknowledge that belief, because sometimes people hold on to their version of the truth even when it no longer fits. Maybe that is what you told yourself, I said gently, and I saw something flicker in her expression, something closer to discomfort than anger. But help does not usually begin with taking control without asking. I continued, my voice steady, not accusing, just clear, and she pressed her lips together, her fingers curling slightly against the edge of the table, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us in a way that felt different from before, not tense, not heavy, but reflective, as if something was being considered rather than avoided. I did not think you would mind, she said finally, and there it was, the assumption laid bare, simple, direct, and more revealing than anything else she had said. I tilted my head slightly, studying her face again, seeing not just the woman she had become, but the years that had shaped her, the choices, the habits, the quiet ways she had learned to justify what she wanted. That is exactly the problem, I said, and she frowned slightly, confused. What do you mean? She asked, and I leaned forward just a little, enough to make sure she heard me clearly. You stopped asking what I would want, I said, and that seemed to land differently, not as a challenge, not as something to argue against, but as something she had not fully considered before, something that shifted the focus away from the money, away from the accounts, and back to something more personal, more fundamental, and I watched as her expression softened just slightly, the sharp edges easing into something more uncertain, more aware, and for the first time since she walked into my kitchen that morning, she did not rush to respond, she did not try to fix it with words, she just sat there, quiet, and in that quiet I could see the beginning of something I had not expected, not resolution, not forgiveness, but awareness, the kind that comes slowly, sometimes too late, but still changes something once it arrives. And as I sat across from her, I realized that this moment was not about winning, not about proving anything. It was about making something clear that had been overlooked for far too long, and once seen, it could not be unseen, no matter what came next. She remained quiet after that, and the silence between us no longer felt like something that needed to be filled, it felt earned, like the natural result of everything that had finally been said without being softened or hidden. I watched her carefully, noticing the way her shoulders had lowered, the way her hands rested still on the table now instead of moving, as if the energy she had walked in with had slowly drained away, replaced by something heavier, something more reflective. I did not realize it looked that way, she said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper, and I believed her, not because it excused anything, but because I understood how easy it is for people to reshape their intentions in their own minds until they no longer recognize the line they have crossed. I nodded slowly, not to comfort her, but to acknowledge that moment, because awareness, even when it comes late, still matters. It did, I said simply, and I let the words sit there without adding anything more, because there was nothing more to explain. She already knew now, at least enough to understand why things had unfolded the way they had. She looked down again, her gaze lingering on the table as if searching for something she had lost there, something she could no longer reach. I thought I was being responsible, she added after a moment, and there was something honest in that, something that did not try to defend, only to explain, and I could see how. She had built that belief, piece by piece, until it felt solid, until it felt right, even if it was not. I leaned back slightly in my chair, taking a slow breath, letting the quiet settle into something calmer, something steadier. Responsibility does not mean replacing someone's choices, I said, my voice still even, still controlled, and she nodded faintly, almost automatically, as if part of her understood before she could fully process it, and for a moment we just sat there, two people who knew each other their entire lives, now seeing each other more clearly than we had in years, not through expectation, not through habit, but through something more direct, more honest. "Is it gone for good?" she asked suddenly, her eyes lifting back to mine, and there it was again, not the question of why, not even the question of what it meant for us, but the question of the money itself, still at the center, still holding its place, and I did not react to that. I did not let it change the calm that had settled in me, because that too was part of the truth. "It is not where you thought it was," I replied, choosing my words carefully, and she studied my face, trying to read something more into that, trying to find certainty in a space I was no longer willing to make easy for her. "So you are not going to tell me?" she asked, and there was no accusation in her voice this time, only quiet understanding, as if she already knew the answer before asking, and I shook my head gently, not as a rejection, but as a boundary, one that did not need to be justified anymore. She exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the window again, and I could see the acceptance beginning to take shape, not fully, not completely, but enough to change something inside her, enough to make her realize that this was not something she could simply talk her way through. And as the silence returned once more, it felt different again, not heavy, not uncertain, but settled in a way that felt final, not as an ending, but as a shift, something that had already happened and could not be undone. And in that quiet, I realized that the account had not just been emptied, something else had been cleared as well, something invisible but just as significant, the space where assumptions used to live, now replaced by something far more difficult to ignore. She stayed seated for a while longer after that, her eyes still turned toward the window, as if the world outside might offer something simpler than what had just unfolded inside this room, and I did not rush her. I did not fill the silence with reassurance or questions, because some realizations need space, they need time to settle without interruption. Eventually she stood up, slower than before, her movements no longer sharp or hurried, but measured, almost careful, like someone learning how to walk again after realizing the ground is not as stable as they once believed. "I should go," she said quietly, and I nodded, not because I wanted her to leave, but because there was nothing more to hold her here, nothing more that needed to be said right now. She hesitated for a second, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, and I could see the unspoken words lingering there, questions she did not know how to ask, apologies she was not ready to form, and perhaps something else. Something closer to understanding, but not fully shaped yet. "I did not mean to," she started, then stopped, her voice trailing off before the sentence could finish, and I did not help her complete it, because intentions, once revealed through actions, do not need to be redefined with words, they simply are what they are. I stood up as well, not out of formality, but because it felt right to meet her at the same level, to stand in the same space without distance, without hierarchy, just two people facing what had become clear between them. "I know what you meant," I said gently, and she looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for something in my expression, something that might tell her whether this was reparable, whether this moment could be undone or softened over time. But I did not give her that answer, not because I wanted to punish her, but because it was not something that could be decided in a single moment. Trust, once altered, does not return all at once, it shifts slowly, if it returns at all. She nodded faintly, accepting that without asking further, and turned toward the door, her steps quiet against the floor, and I followed a few steps behind, not to escort her out, but to be present as she left, to witness the end of something that had changed without either of us fully noticing until now. She paused at the doorway, her hand on the handle, and for a brief second it felt like she might turn back. Like she might say something that would hold her there a little longer, but she did not. She simply opened the door and stepped outside, and just like that, the house returned to its quiet, the same quiet that had once felt empty, but now felt different, not heavy, not hollow, but clear, as if something unnecessary had finally been removed. I stood there for a moment after the door closed, listening to the faint sound of her car starting in the driveway, then fading as she drove away. And I realized that what I had protected was not just money, not just numbers in an account, but something far more important, something I had almost given away without realizing it, the right to decide, the right to remain fully present in my own life, to not be gently pushed aside under the name of care or convenience. I walked back into the kitchen and sat down again. The same chair, the same table, everything unchanged on the surface, but entirely different underneath. I picked up my cup, now lukewarm, and took a small sip, the taste slightly bitter, but steady, familiar, and as I set it down, I felt no urgency, no need to fix what had happened, no need to chase after what had just left, because some things are not meant to be chased, they are meant to be understood, and in that understanding, something settles, something quiet and firm that does not need to be spoken aloud to be real. I had not lost anything that morning, not truly. I had only let go of something I should have seen more clearly a long time ago. And in its place, I was left with something simpler. Something stronger, something that no one else could move without my knowing, not again.